Good evening, I'm Mike Knetter, and welcome back to our UW Now Livestream series, where we bring you experts from the UW community talking about timely and important topics. After more than 16 months, Ukraine has held back the Russian invasion and is now launching a counteroffensive. Will that be successful? And what did the recent Wagner group mutiny reveal about Russian security and morale? And what will it mean for the political and military strategy for both sides going forward? What are the prospects for nuclear escalation? Joining us to discuss these and other related issues are three experts from the UW Political Science Department. Andrew Kydd is a professor of political science and an affiliate of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia. Yoshiko Herrera is a professor of comparative politics and international relations and the former director of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia. And Mikhail Troitskiy is a professor of practice in Russian studies in the Department of Political Science. Thank you all for taking time out of your Tuesday to join us, and we look forward to a really interesting program. Leading us off tonight is Professor Andrew Kydd, who is also an affiliate of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia, as noted. His research interests center on game theoretic analysis of international security issues such as proliferation, terrorism, trust, and conflict resolution. He's published widely in journals such as American Political Science Review, International Organization, World Politics, and International Security. His book, Trust and Mistrust in International Relations, was published in 2005 by the Princeton University Press. In 2006, it won the Conflict Process's Best Book Award. Prior to coming to UW in 2007, he taught at the University of California, Riverside, and at Harvard University. Professor Kydd, welcome back to our program, and thanks for leading us off this evening.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be back, although I guess it would be even better to be back for a final wrap-up after the war is over. But the war continues, and so we still need to think about it. So if you could put up the slides, then I can start going through that. So my focus is going to be how the war is going in 2023, this year, and prospects for the future, for ending the war, how things might turn out, and perhaps a little bit on NATO if we have time at the end. So in the winter and spring of 2023, this year, the headlines were dominated by the battle around Bakhmut, which was a town in eastern Ukraine, sort of in the middle of the Eastern Front. We'll put up a map in a little bit, and we can show you where that is. The Russians were attacking there. Famously, the Wagner group of mercenaries, the so-called private military company, was spearheading that attack and losing large numbers of men in the process. And they eventually prevailed at great cost in capturing that town. So relatively small gain. Bakhmut is not an especially strategically located place, as we'll see. But it was a symbolic victory for Russia and for the Wagner forces and Prigozhin, the leader of those forces. Somewhat less visibly or less prominently, the Russians spent that time preparing defensive positions to try to block future Ukrainian efforts to retake the territory that Russia seized in 2022. And we'll see those in the map in a second as well. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians, aside from defending at Bakhmut, spent a lot of their time and effort on training up some new forces with Western supplied equipment, with Western trainers from the UK, from the United States. And so they trained a force of about 30,000 men in 9 brigades. If you're a sort of military historian of the old school, that's like about 3 divisions worth of troops, which may seem like a lot. On the other hand, if you compare it to the big battles of, say, World War II, Eastern Front, Germany and Russia had well over 100 divisions engaged in that war. So 3 is relatively small, but they are increasingly well-trained and well-armed, with one drawback or one sort of lack that we'll see in a second. Maybe the next slide. But the big sort of focus and excitement now is on the Ukrainian counteroffensive. So Ukraine began a long-awaited counteroffensive in early June 2023, a little over a month ago. And unfortunately, the gains have been small compared to their offensive successes in the fall of 2022, last year, when they successfully took back a lot of territory around Kharkiv in the north and Kherson in the south. They made big gains there. But the offensive is going pretty slowly at this point. The Russians had enough time to harden their lines and defend them, and are successfully defending them against the Ukrainian efforts to advance. So we're not seeing big breakthrough battles. We're not seeing any mobility, any sort of tanks running across the steppes sort of action. We're seeing meter by meter, kilometer by kilometer, slow advances as the Ukrainians wear down the Russian forces and take small chunks of territory at a time, looking for weak spots and trying to weaken the Russian ability to resist and open up possibilities for the future. So if we could go to the map, actually, that would be great if we could substitute that in. So here's a map from the Institute for the Study of War, which is a great resource if you want to follow the war geographically. And if you can move the map down just a little bit, we'll get the other way. Sorry. Yeah, we could there. So up. This gives us sort of an orientation. You see Ukraine in the sort of center of the picture. Belarus is up to the north. That's where Prigozhin was supposed to go, but didn't apparently. And to the northwest of that is Lithuania, where the NATO summit is being held right now. Vilnius, in the capital of Vilnius there. So that gives you an orientation to where we're at. And the region in pink is the region of Russian occupied territory, and the line between that and Ukraine is where the front line is. And so that's a good zoom level for now. If you look to the eastern front, there's sort of a front that goes from roughly Odessa in the far east over to, or far west, sort of over towards the sort of bend around Donetsk, which you can think of as the southern front. And then there's the eastern front, which goes straight up north from there. And Bakhmut is sort of in the middle of that eastern front along there, and hence not actually that strategically important. The big thing that people have been looking for is a southern offensive that would try to cut through the southern front over to the Sea of Azov, which is to the south of that region right there, exactly where the cursor is. If the Ukrainians were able to cut through anywhere along that line from Melitopol over to Mariupol and get access to the Sea of Azov, they would basically cut the Russian occupied territory in two and make it very difficult for the Russians to supply the remnants of the the western portions of the territories that they've occupied, in particular Crimea. So if you could zoom in towards Crimea, there's one other interesting thing I want to show people. So at this level of aggregation, one more zoom in. The ISW folks have helpfully put in these little triangles which signify defensive lines that the Russians have established. And these could be mines, these can be tank traps, these can be pillboxes, these certainly are trenches and machine gun posts and the like. And you can see they've really heavily fortified that southern front because that's where they're expecting the Ukrainians to attack. That's where the Ukrainians really want to break through. And they have scattered fortifications elsewhere. But an interesting aspect, I thought, just in passing, is if you look down to Crimea and the peninsula between Crimea, or the isthmus, sorry, between Crimea and mainland Ukraine, so down to the south and to the west, there you go. You'll see a line of fortifications along the northern edge of Crimea, which signifies that the Russians are essentially anticipating the possibility that they may have to defend Crimea, all by itself, that they may lose everything else and have to fall back on lines to try to defend Crimea. And then even stranger and more telling, I think, is there's a little line of fortifications along the isthmus on the eastern portion of the Crimean Peninsula, right there, separating that little bit of territory, which is next to the Kerch Strait, which has the Kerch Bridge, which connects with Russia. And so they've even started fortifying a fallback position if they lose the rest of Crimea to try to stop the Ukrainians from getting right up to the Kerch Bridge. So that either indicates a certain prudence or a certain pessimism about their chances in the long term. Anyway, that's what I wanted to show you in terms of the map. We can go back to the slides at this point. And the next one. Okay, so just briefly, why is the Ukrainian offensive taking a while, or why is it seemingly slow? It's essentially unrealistic to try to expect lightning advances in a situation like this. Usually, the defense requires, or the offense. Defense is usually much easier than offense, right? Defensive people, if you're on the defense, you can be buried, you can be in your trenches and your foxholes. You don't have to get up, you don't have to move, and it's the enemy who has to get up and break cover and move, and so that makes them much more vulnerable. So the offense is usually thought to require a 3-to-1 local force advantage, and the Ukrainians don't have an overall numerical force advantage, which means that they need to concentrate forces to try to break through. So it's very difficult to break through against these prepared entrenched positions that the Russians have put together. And the comparison is the World War I example of trench warfare. After the front stabilized in late 1914, the trench warfare lasted for about 4 years, and hardly any gains were made on either side, despite massive efforts to do so, both with human wave attacks and with technology like inventing the tank. And it was only the Germans in 1918 who really solved the problem by creating these highly trained small units who were able to take advantage of cover and use other sort of unconventional weapons like poison gas to suppress the artillery on the other side, that they were able to start making gains in their spring offensives. But by then it was too late for them, and they ran out of steam and eventually lost the war. The solution today is what's called a combined arms warfare. We integrate the artillery, the infantry, the tanks, the air power all together, have them communicating very closely, locating targets, taking them out. And the Ukrainians are getting trained in this, but they lack a key element, which is the air power side of things, right? They've got the infantry and artillery and tanks, although they don't have a lot of ammunition and don't have a lot of tanks. But they're completely lacking on the air power dimension. And that's why the F-16s are such a big point of debate now, whether Ukraine should be given F-16s. And recently, they agreed that NATO countries would be training Ukrainian pilots on F-16s in anticipation of getting them. All right, next slide. So how long will the war last? My estimation is it could last several more years. If you look at a somewhat similar war, the Iran-Iraq war lasted 8 years. Both sides were using older technology. D-Day, for instance, just another point of comparison, was June 6, 1944. That was 2.5 years after the United States entered World War II. And even in terms of the Normandy battle itself, the Allied forces didn't break out of Normandy, it's a fairly contained peninsula in France, until 2 months later, basically at the end of July, beginning of August 1944. So we've only been 1 month into this offensive. So again, patience is counseled. These things take time. Final slide on negotiations. Is a negotiated solution likely in the near term? My sense is unlikely, for two main reasons. Number one, Putin may think he would be overthrown if he agrees to a negotiated solution in which Russia withdraws and he's got nothing to show for the war. And number two, Ukraine probably still thinks they can win on the battlefield. They're getting a lot of Western aid. They're hoping at least for a Russian collapse of some sort. And the sort of cracks in the facade of Russian power are beginning to show with the Prigozhin and the Wagner group, what's going on there. So I think Ukraine is still very optimistic of their chances on the battlefield, and Putin is extremely pessimistic about his chances if he doesn't have any profit to show out of this war, and it appears to be a catastrophic mistake, which would certainly be the case if he withdraws and loses what he had before even. So a negotiated solution strikes me as unlikely at this point. So we're in for a fair amount of further fighting, I think, unfortunately. And I'll leave it there.
Well, you said it, Andrew. I wish we didn't have to do this show over and over again, because partly I'm worried we're going to have to pay you a pension eventually. But Thank you for those remarks, and we'll come back to you with questions shortly. Our next guest is Professor Yoshiko Herrera, former director of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia. Before arriving at Madison in 2007, she was the John Loeb Associate Professor of Social Sciences at Harvard University. Her research focuses on Russia, nationalism and ethnic politics, and political economy, and has been published in numerous academic outlets. She teaches courses on comparative politics, social identities and diversity, and now a new course on the Russian war in Ukraine. In 2021, she is a recipient of the Chancellor's Distinguished Teaching Award at UW-Madison, and she's also the former director of our partnership with Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. She earned a PhD in political science at the University of Chicago. Professor Herrera, it's great to have you back on the show. You called this right out of the gate. You said this is going to be a nightmare for Putin. I think I wasn't so sure about that at the time when you said that, and you've proven to be correct. So tell us, what are your thoughts today?
Okay, thanks. Well, yes, I'm happy to be back here with you. But yeah, like Professor Kydd said, I wish that it was under better circumstances. Okay, let's start the slideshow. I think this is not my slides, unfortunately. This is the next show. But okay, here we go. Yes. So I'm going to talk about the problems in Russia. And to sum up, Russia's facing enormous problems. I'm going to talk about the recent political issue with the mutiny and the economy a bit. But I want to highlight a conclusion, which is that no matter what the problems are in Russia, unfortunately, the war is going to end when things change for Ukraine, and in particular, when Ukraine gets the weaponry and supplies that it needs to push Russian forces out of Ukraine. So I think I'm a little bit less pessimistic in terms of the timeline for Ukraine, because I think that there is a will and a desire by the West to end the war quickly. But what I want to emphasize is that despite whatever problems are happening in Russia, I don't think the domestic political situation in Russia is going to be what ends the war. Okay, but let's move on to the recent political intrigues. And I want to start with the players, which people may not be aware of, all of them anyways. We all know probably Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, in the middle. And on the left-hand side is the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, and the chief of the general staff and the commander of the war in Ukraine, General Valery Gerasimov. This is sort of the regular Russian military. You have the minister of defense and you have the head of the commander of all the Russian armed forces. On the other hand, on the other side, on the right-hand side at the top, you have Yevgeny Prigozhin, who had been the head of the Wagner private military corporation. He's sometimes described as a chef, but it's more, I think, accurate to say that he's sort of, he is a billionaire and he is a fixer, and he's somebody that collects money for different tasks that he does for Putin. He long denied having anything to do with Wagner. He even sued a BBC journalist for libel for saying he was the head of Wagner. And Wagner initially was not supposed to be associated with the Russian state because they were a mercenary group that did things that the Russian state wanted to deny. So operating in different countries in Africa, like the Central African Republic or Mali, etc. And they were not, as a private military company, they were not in direct competition with the guys on the left, Shoigu and Gerasimov, because they were doing different things and they were doing things that the Russian state wanted to deny that Russia was involved in. So as long as Wagner was operating in other contexts and Prigozhin was getting kickbacks from things like providing food to the military, he wasn't really a threat to the normal military structure. But when the military operation, the special military operation in Ukraine started going badly, they brought in the Wagner PMC because they were supposed to be sort of special forces, highly trained and able to do a better job potentially to help reinvigorate the war effort in Ukraine. And so one of the things that Wagner did was wage this big battle at Bakhmut. They put enormous resources into it, and they looked somewhat successful, although they never fully took over Bakhmut. But at that point, Wagner is in direct competition for resources and status with the guys on the left, with Shoigu and Gerasimov. And Prigozhin starts complaining very loudly about how the war effort is going, about supplies, about the organization, about bribery, etc. The person on the bottom right is General Sergei Surovikin. Surovikin is also known as General Armageddon. He's the commander of the Russian Aerospace Forces, so the Air Force and the Space Forces. He's also a hardened fighter going all the way back to Afghanistan. He's been involved in all Russia's major military operations. And he was seen as a more competent general, and at one point was put in charge of the entire Russian war operation in Ukraine last October, but then he was replaced by Gerasimov. So you could see that there is a bit of tension or competition between Shoigu and Gerasimov on the one hand, and Surovikin, who was demoted and Gerasimov replaced him in January. And then you have Prigozhin now complaining about how the war is going and what his Wagner troops are getting vis-a-vis the rest of the military. Things really heated up in May when Prigozhin started putting out a series of just scathing videos criticizing Shoigu and Gerasimov in the strongest terms, demanding more resources for his troops. And it looked like Shoigu and Gerasimov had won that battle with Prigozhin, because in June, it was announced that all the Wagner troops were going to have to sign contracts with the regular Ministry of Defense, which would essentially disband Wagner. And that led to the mutiny. So next slide. Okay, so the mutiny started unexpectedly on June 23rd, when Prigozhin and his Wagner PMC troops left Ukraine. You can see gray in the graphic there, and part of the troops went south down to Rostov-on-Don. Rostov is important because that's where the headquarters of the entire military operation, Russia's military operation for Ukraine, is being organized from. So the Rostov military headquarters is not just any regional city. It's where the whole operation for Ukraine is being handled. Prigozhin and some of his troops got into Rostov, went right to the military headquarters, apparently unopposed. And some of the troops then started going north on what Prigozhin called the March for Justice. So he is claiming that he wanted Shoigu and Gerasimov, he wanted to replace them, he wanted to capture them or do something with them. He was directing his ire at Shoigu and Gerasimov. But nevertheless, as the night rolled on through June 23rd, 24th, it's looking more and more iffy for the Russian military, because the Wagner troops are advancing towards Moscow and they don't appear to be facing any opposition. And in the process, Wagner troops claim that they were fired on by regular Russian Army Air Force forces. And so they shot down 6 Russian helicopters and 1 plane, which is kind of an extraordinary loss for the Russian military. It's a bigger loss in one day than anything they've suffered in the war in Ukraine. And so this is looking extremely tense. But abruptly, the next day on June 24th, Wagner stops its march of justice, and instead it's announced that Wagner troops are going to Belarus, Prigozhin is going to Belarus. The Wagner troops who participated could get amnesty if they weren't too involved, and they could join the regular Russian Ministry of Defense troops. So it's a very, very strange thing for many reasons. Because even though there were tensions there, people did not expect this kind of mutiny. And initially, there's a lot of discussion of whether it was a coup, whether Prigozhin was actually trying to replace Putin. He claimed he wasn't, but it looked very strange. Next slide. This is a still picture from a video that Prigozhin released on his Telegram channel on the evening of the mutiny on June 24th. And it's really extraordinary because he's sitting there in the Southern Military District headquarters in Rostov, where his troops have just rolled in. And he's there with 2 top military officials: the Deputy Minister of Defense, Yevkurov, on the left, and the Deputy General Chief of Staff, Alexeyev, on the right. Alexeyev, by the way, is he's involved in the GRU, in the Defense Intelligence Unit there. He was sanctioned by the U.S. for his role in 2016 election interference in the U.S. He was sanctioned by the EU and Europe for his role in the Skripal poisonings, and he's also ethnic Ukrainian, adding to the complications. But anyways, Prigozhin releases a video where he's chatting with these two, and he's saying things like, "We want Shoigu and Gerasimov. Where are they?" And Alexeyev jokes with him and says, "Well, go ahead and take them." And this is not the kind of reaction you might expect if somebody is waging a coup or some kind of mutiny, that they can come into the military headquarters and demand the defense minister and the chief of the general staff. So this video is just kind of amazing in showing some level of complicity in the high level military with Prigozhin, even though these two are apparently not on Prigozhin's side. And that is indicative, I think, of one of the challenges there, that it immediately brings up questions of how much support does Prigozhin actually have. I think up until this point, up until June 24th, people did not think Prigozhin had that level of support in the military that it turned out that it's suspected that he had. And that leads to the conundrum of what the Russian regular military should do about Prigozhin, because if Prigozhin has support within the rank and file troops or within others or within other officers, this could be a very dangerous situation for Russia overall. And the level of support was unclear. But things like this video just highlighted the uncertainty of where people's loyalties lie. Next slide. Okay, so what does it mean? I would characterize the response by Putin and his government as late, weak, and puzzling. It was late because it wasn't initially clear what the orders were for the Russian military. Why didn't they stop Prigozhin before he got so close to Moscow, within 200 meters? Why did Belarus have to come in with Lukashenko, the head of Belarus, to negotiate the end of this? Why couldn't it have been handled within Russia? Interestingly, Shoigu and Gerasimov are still in place. Gerasimov only showed up by video, undated video, but still by video yesterday. So there was some questions about whether he was ousted or not, but he's finally made a TV appearance by video. Shoigu has been on TV. Prigozhin is still at large. He wasn't arrested. He didn't apparently go to Belarus like he was supposed to. And on the right is a graphic from the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, who said that the Kremlin has no information about Prigozhin's whereabouts. That's what they said on June 29th. And then just yesterday, they announced that actually Prigozhin had been in talks with Putin for 3 hours on that day, which is all the more strange, along with other Wagner commanders. So it seems that Putin was negotiating with him. He was in the Kremlin, but he wasn't arrested. And now they just aren't saying anything about where he is. Meanwhile, General Armageddon, Surovikin, is presumed detained because he has not been seen since the coup. And he also, along with that Alexeyev on the previous slide, had posted videos imploring the Wagner troops to stop their mutiny and to stand down. But nevertheless, Surovikin has not been seen, and there's some speculation that he was involved in this mutiny. I think the takeaways from this are that everybody now thinks that Putin and his regime is weaker than we had thought. That they could arrest artists and teenagers, etc. It was clear, but the cracks within the military establishment were not so clear. In addition, I think it's important that Prigozhin's complaints about the poor conditions for the military, about the lack of supplies, and also about the false pretenses for the war all ring true with the population and with rank and file soldiers, which I think is deeply delegitimizing for the regime and the war. So even though Prigozhin didn't make it to Moscow, even though the mutiny seems to have fizzled out, the criticisms that he leveled against the government remain out there in the air, unaccounted for. And as long as Shoigu and Gerasimov are still in place, it just highlights that the strategy and the organization of the war remain problematic. Okay, next slide. Another thing I want to highlight, in addition to these cracks within the military establishment and this very extraordinary mutiny, is that the Russian economy remains in deep crisis. This year, compared to last year, the government is really running out of money because oil and gas revenues, tax revenues from those are way down. The graphic on the right is just showing the recent rise in the dollar to ruble exchange rate. The ruble is losing value. It's now at 90 rubles to the dollar. Before 2014, it was around 30. Then let's say it went up to in the 60s. And so it's actually worse even compared to the post-2014 levels. Last year, they were able to manage the ruble by doing a lot of currency restriction, trade restrictions, and there was a big decrease in imports. But a lot of that is coming to an end, and so the ruble continues to decline, and as do living standards. So that's just inflationary. In addition, there's serious labor shortages, and the Russian government has started hiding or selectively releasing or using other tricks to try to prop up GDP numbers, try to make it look like inflation isn't as high as it is. So I think that the information we're getting about the Russian economy is also becoming more suspect as the crisis continues. And like with the sanctions last year, this deglobalization and the role of the Russian government growing in the economy continues unabated. So I think that long term, the economy is in big trouble, but we can see even in the short term that the government is going to face from people more and more visibility in the economic crisis that it created. Next slide. And this is just, I'll wrap up. Again, to say that in the end game, I don't see there's any alternative to Ukraine winning this war. It's just a matter of time, and it's a matter of how much support Ukraine gets. I don't think there's any chance that Russia is going to back down. It's going to leave Ukraine when it's militarily defeated. And I guess just in reverse order here of these points, I want to note that the apparent support for the government in surveys and things like that that we see in Russia, I think hides a lot of indifference as well as opposition. And I think that just like with this mutiny, we saw that even the apparent support for the government, I think, could dissipate quickly under the right circumstances. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Yoshiko. The plot certainly thickens with the Wagner mutiny and all the fracturing of relationships that we see in the military structure associated with that. So we'll come back with questions shortly. Our final guest tonight is Professor Mikhail Troitskiy, a visiting professor of practice, and he studied conflicts, security, and politics in Eurasia, Russian foreign policy and U.S.-Russia relations, arms control, and international negotiation. He's a member of the Scholars Network's program on new approaches to research and security in Eurasia and the processes of international negotiation program. Troitskiy was a deputy director and program officer at the Russia office of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. I've heard PBS News say that many, many times. From 2009 to 2015, he taught at European University at St. Petersburg from 2014 to 2022, and at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations from 2003 to 2022. He was also Dean of the School of Government and International Affairs in 2017 to 2022 at Moscow State. So, Professor Troitskiy, welcome to our program, and let me say we're looking forward to hearing your remarks, surely shaped by some firsthand experience on the ground.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike, and I hope you can hear me. Great honor to be here. So, let me give you an overview of the nuclear factor as it is present now in Russia's war against Ukraine. So these are my punchlines, so to say, what I and perhaps the takeaways that I want our viewers to get from this brief talk. So my first point is going to be that it is going to be difficult. It would be difficult for the Russian leadership for many reasons that I plan on covering in my presentation to actually go ahead and decide to use nuclear weapons and then implement that decision. That said, we shouldn't rule out an out-of-hand escalation or even a deliberate nuclear use by Russia, mainly because such use could come on the whim of just one person whose mind it is notoriously difficult to read. So let me get straight into it, and if you could bring up my first slide. So let's just discuss what we need to consider as we assess the risk of nuclear weapons being used or acts of nuclear sabotage being carried out in the course of Russia's war against Ukraine. So first, Russian President Putin mentioned the possibility of Russia actually resorting to nuclear weapons at several critical points, at several junctures during the war. And his most stark warning came as Russia was launching its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. At that time, Putin warned Ukraine supporters in the West of dire consequences should they interfere with Russia's invasion. And you see, a screenshot of that address by Putin to the nation on February 24th, 2022. Now, second, in March 2023, Putin ordered Russian nuclear weapons to be deployed in Belarus. And Belarusian President Lukashenko, pictured here on the right, agreed to accept Russian nuclear weapons on Belarusian territory. And that move is considered by some observers as preparation for a nuclear attack against Ukraine or possibly even NATO from the territory of Belarus, so that NATO would not dare to strike Russia in response, but would have to confine with retaliation just against Belarus. Now, if we could bring up the second slide, we could talk about some more risk factors. So we have heard Putin's associates make overt nuclear threats, and most notably last week, former Russian President Medvedev suggested that Ukraine was in fact targeting a nuclear power plant in Smolensk, Russia, by long-range missiles that were given to Ukraine by the United Kingdom. And those missiles were supposedly shot down by Russian missile defenses, but Medvedev said Russia should strike several nuclear power plants in Ukraine in retaliation for an attack on a Russian nuclear power plant by Kiev, by Ukraine. And it is not clear what Ukraine could gain from an attack on a Russian nuclear power plant. So this statement by Medvedev could point to a potential scenario in which something happens at the Russian nuclear power plant, then this attack is blamed on Ukraine. And so Russia gets a pretext to strike or sabotage Ukrainian nuclear power plants. And you see those, essentially 4 Ukrainian power plants on this map on the left. Now, Russia seized early on the biggest Ukrainian power plant, nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, and it really happened very early in the war, even to the detriment of achieving other important objectives. So Russia really wanted to seize the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, and Russia holds on to it as an outpost in Ukraine, which it would be difficult for Ukraine to attack and take back. Again, then finally, some rather mainstream Russian experts, aside from, the the top politicians such as Putin and Medvedev have proposed nuclear strikes against Ukraine and NATO, or at the very least, they have proposed risky brinkmanship behavior by Moscow in order to reinstate what they call fear of Russia as a nuclear-armed country, as a nuclear-armed actor. And so this likely reflects the thinking of some influential faction in the Russian government. And we don't know whether that faction includes or doesn't include President Putin, but I think it is likely that he contemplates this sort of scenarios. And so these experts act as kind of as his mouthpiece, or just, they are throwing out trial balloons. And then, so all of this suggests that the risk is real. And we also have on the record comments by top US officials who express fears over direct confrontation between NATO and Russia because they believe such confrontation may quickly escalate into a nuclear war. And the US has gone to great lengths trying to get China on board American effort to warn Putin against contemplating use of nuclear weapons. So if we could bring up the third slide, we could discuss several reasons that we have to think that it would still be hard for Russia to decide to go nuclear and then actually go nuclear. Now, first, observers have pointed out that what Russia calls its red lines have already been moved quite a number of times. For example, as Professor Kydd just mentioned in his presentation, Russian forces retreated massively at least 3 times during the war under pressure from Ukraine. That was from Kiev, from Kherson region, and also from Kharkiv region. And there was no escalation in any of those cases. Now, Ukraine has also been receiving ever more powerful weapons from its partners. They went all the way from debating supplies of just some anti-tank weapons to then cruise missiles, and then to supplying the F-16 fighter jets, and now even cluster munitions made available to Ukraine. And they still, got away with it. Russia never escalated. Now, we also have some players that get away with acting resolutely and even recklessly vis-a-vis Russia and, personally, Putin. For example, Turkish President Erdogan has a record of complete neglect for Russia's stated position and most recently he just decided to return to Ukraine several Ukrainian prisoners of war whom he previously agreed with Russia to keep interned in Turkey until the end of the war. And, apparently Russian officials were outraged, but did nothing. Now, second, what gives us hope is that Russia just went through a mutiny during which Putin accused its perpetrators of treason and promised to destroy them. And yet the leader of the mutiny, Yevgeny Prigozhin, whom Professor Herrera just profiled, continues to operate freely in Russia, and there has been no public reckoning with those whom Putin called traitors. And it signals to many observers that Putin is weak and not in the mood for leading. Then you may ask who in Russia would take the responsibility for implementing Putin's orders for a nuclear strike, even if he even failed to stop the mutineers from closing in on Moscow so fast. And then also China has been adamant that it doesn't want the nuclear Pandora box to be opened because of unpredictable consequences for the strategies of China's neighbors, and also because of massive contamination of Ukrainian agricultural land that feeds many developing countries, among whom China looks to establish itself as a patron. So Beijing wouldn't be interested in a Russian nuclear strike against Ukraine, and Chairman Xi Jinping has apparently warned Putin more than once against going nuclear, and he likes to kind of mention that Chinese have leaked that information a number of times to top international media to kind of show that they are working to prevent Putin from contemplating nuclear strikes. But in any case, if you look beyond China and consider international reactions to a potential nuclear escalation by Russia, you cannot make a cogent argument. You cannot even think of a cogent argument that would justify Russian nuclear strikes. Some rather mainstream Russian pundits have argued that defeating a nuclear-armed country is impossible short of using nuclear weapons, right? But really few, if anyone, agrees with that kind of statement. If having to withdraw from internationally recognized Ukrainian territory constitutes a defeat for Russia, right? So everyone believes that in a situation of a catastrophic assault by an enemy on the Russian capital, the Kremlin will not shy away from using nuclear weapons. But few people believe that Russia's survival really depends on Russia's ability to annex internationally recognized territory of another country. And finally, it really looks to some people, including myself, that Putin has what they call a double, a person who stands in for him occasionally. And that is purely speculative. But I think it is an important factor because nuclear launch or sabotage orders may lack credibility to those who are down the chain of command and who may suspect foul play, who really may have doubts about whether it's the real Putin who's giving those orders or they come from someone else, from a fake Putin. Now, the problem with all this analysis is, of course, that we just have a list of factors, and I struggle to assess how relevant or strong they are separately or taken together. And even if we believe that some of the constraints that I've just listed are strong enough, the risk is still present. And let's just conclude by discussing why the risk is still present. And So first and foremost, it's just because currently it takes one person, that is Putin, to order a nuclear strike or an act of nuclear sabotage. And so some experts say that even if some people down the chain of command may feel, hard pressed to drag their feet on such orders, there are many others who would implement those orders meticulously. And how much Putin is really deterred from going nuclear, we simply cannot know, because he may be constantly changing his mind. And he may now need to look strong and reckless in the face of, or in the wake of the mutiny that Professor Herrera just analyzed, and that showed Putin's weakness, as she mentioned. So, for example, someone didn't shy away from blowing up the Kakhovka Dam on the Dnieper River, triggering what may be the worst environmental disaster in Europe in decades. And that is comparable, the scale of that catastrophe is comparable to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident that happened in 1986. So, and you see on this picture, basically the desertification of Ukrainian land that is going on as the water dries up. And second, for now, the United States has said that it doesn't see an elevated risk of escalation, which strongly irritates those elements in the Russian government who would very much like to restore fear. And we see reports of resumed harassment of US planes and drones in places such as Syria. And attempts at brinkmanship and provocative behavior may easily just get out of hand and lead to uncontrolled escalation. So the problem with fear is that fear exists only when the line between threats and actual nuclear use is blurred. And third, Russian military commanders on the war theater may just take the initiative and decide they will not be able to hold the ground short of a diversion created by a nuclear accident in Zaporizhia or elsewhere. And so the Kakhovka dam was very likely blown up to prevent what looked like an imminent assault by the Ukrainians, by the Ukrainian forces across the Dnieper. And fourth, what happens in case of a new coup attempt? Will the use of nuclear weapons become more likely? And Prigozhin was notably against going nuclear. And he accused Putin's commanders and associates, of talking about the possibility of a nuclear Armageddon too lightly. Right, and the United States is apparently worried about Russian nuclear weapons falling into the hands of some new warlord mutineers. And so the Ukrainians suggested yesterday to Reuters that the Wagner mutineers planned on and were actually close to seizing portable nuclear explosive devices outside of the Russian city of Voronezh as they advanced towards Moscow. But many experts believe that should a new successful coup happen, its leaders would try to establish their credentials as responsible people, and they would reach out to Washington and others to reassure them of the safety of the Russian nuclear arsenal. But of course, in a situation of chaos, warlords may seize the opportunity to sell some things nuclear to the highest bidder globally. So, and finally, war is a very volatile environment. So we shouldn't rule out situations in which the temptation to use, nuclear weapons or resort to nuclear sabotage will be hard to resist. And for example, because of that may happen because of increased opportunities to deny responsibility while achieving some, needed results. So to sum up, use of nuclear weapons or nuclear sabotage remains unlikely, given what we know and understand from open sources. But real life, and especially war, is always more complicated than we can imagine. And we cannot reliably predict actions of individual leaders in crisis situations when the nuclear threshold has already been at least verbally lowered. So everyone should remain on guard. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mikhail. I am going to try to fire off some questions very rapidly because we have consumed most of our hour here. But I'm going to ask all three of you the following question. You can only give a one-word answer. Should the United States give more, about the same, or less help militarily to Ukraine? Andrew Kydd.
I'd say more, specifically.
That's enough. Oh, they'll get more. Yoshiko.
More.
Mikhail.
Well, yeah.
No. Okay, that's only one word.
I'm not saying no. I'm saying, the United States has treaded very carefully, and it should continue to kind of tread very carefully based on the calculation of risk that is available to those who are in the know, so to say. I'm not in the know. So I support, the policy of those who are in the know.
That was an extreme violation of the rules. I appreciate your answer, though. Second question. Are the European allies stepping up more than they used to? And I think, Andrew, you put something in the chat about this. Tell us, are they kind of honoring commitments that we feel like they made to be bigger partners militarily?
Yeah, there's a great article in the Washington Post that I put in the chat. I could put that in the comments, or somebody could put that in the comments as well.
Yes,
for everyone to see, which has a bunch of data on the war. And one of the things is a comparison of U.S. versus European contributions. And the European contribution is actually larger in total by quite a bit. The U.S. military contribution is a bit higher than the European one. But the European financial contribution is higher than the American one. And in terms of refugees, there's no comparison. The United States basically isn't really in that game, and the Europeans are spending a lot to help out Ukrainian refugees.
Fair point. Nancy Aronson-Knorr asked, why do troops join the Wagner group versus the Russian military? Is it compensation, status, training, easier assignments. Yoshiko, what's with the Wagner group, and why is that so popular?
That's kind of an easy answer. It's two things. One is they pay more, so they generally pay more. But two, they recruited from prisons, and so they took people who had no prospect of getting out of prison, and also people with ailments like HIV or tuberculosis, hepatitis, who were not getting medication in prison, who were basically facing a death sentence in prison. And they gave them the option to go be cannon fodder in Ukraine, be on the front lines in Bakhmut, and try to survive that way. So prison conscripts and
is that latter reason though just recent with the Ukraine, or was Wagner always recruiting from prisons? Because they've been around for a while.
Yeah, I think that's a more recent development, and they stopped it for a while, but it's kind of it's not clear if they're actually. A funny thing in the mutiny is that the Wagner recruitment posters were taken down and then they were put back up within days. So that's an open question whether they're still recruiting actually.
And another just generic, broad question. At times, maybe a year ago or more, I was a little bit worried about how the autocrats were looking pretty successful in this world, and the democracies were looking maybe less successful. How do you see that today? Are the democracies looking a bit stronger? And what are your thoughts about autocracies versus democracies right now?
There's some really strong autocracies, namely China. And Russia is trying to shore up support from some of the worst ones, Iran and North Korea. But there is a unity in Europe to support, if not full-throated support of democracy, to not support a war criminal genocidal regime like Putin. So I think Putin has given autocracy a bad name. And to some extent, I think he's shifted the moral ground in support of democracy or some kind of form of limited government that limits this kind of behavior.
5 years from now, where will Prigozhin be? Above ground or below?
Below.
I would say he doesn't live a very healthy lifestyle.
Self-induced. That's not what I was thinking.
But probably I think he's very desperate. So, but he has survived for a long time. He started out his career in a Soviet prison before he met Putin. So I don't know. I wouldn't count him out exactly.
Well, he has insurance. He knows a lot about everyone, and he was at the tip of plenty of operations in Africa and elsewhere. So I think with that insurance, you can easily live long enough, maybe outside of Russia. And that depends on the political dynamic within Russia. It might be that, given that dynamic, they will no longer care about, Prigozhin out there, whoever is vying for power in Russia.
Another question about alliances around the globe. One of the surprising things, I guess, to me as this Russian endeavor unfolded is how many countries wanted to stay neutral. And does anyone want to address, has that shifted at all? Do you think countries are maybe starting to drift toward the Ukraine side or toward the Russian side? Any thoughts about where those global alliances lie?
Well, just briefly, I don't think you see a huge amount of movement on the global scale. There's still a bunch of countries that don't really want to take sides, which is fine because the most important ones do. But the big one recently has been Turkey, which has just lurched in the Ukrainian side in a big way just over the past week, approving the Swedish admission to NATO, allowing the people who were defending the Azov steel plant to go free, which reneges on a deal that they made with Putin to negotiate their release. So that's, Erdogan is kind of a volatile person himself, so I wouldn't say that that's always the way it's going to be, or that's something we can bank on forever. But those are good developments.
Any other thoughts, Mikhail? Or...
Yes, some key countries, and I think Professor Kydd is correct, addressing sort of key cases. Turkey is one key case. Then, of course, China and India are other two cases. So China has been lukewarmly supporting Russia while trying to kind of also pay tribute to the U.S. position and requests for warnings against nuclear use, I think China is kind of remains as opportunistic as it was, and it just wants to reap benefit from interaction with the United States. And I think the Biden administration has been making this very clear, and I think China sort of understood that line about companies withdrawing, U.S. companies withdrawing from Russia, and he doesn't want to wreak the same kind of havoc on China should not just the U.S. but many other countries, of course the European Union as well, become very unhappy. And so China is kind of towing this line, even sort of becoming less attached to Russia. And then you have countries like United Arab Emirates that are just using the opportunity to reap benefit and maintain neutrality. But I think they are quite susceptible to pressure by the West as well, if need be.
I might stay with you, Mikhail, for one more question from Randy Hillebrand, who I know is in Kyiv. He asks, what do you think if Russia uses tactical nuclear weapons will be the response of the US and the EU?
Well, I think we had it in the media, sort of semi-official reporting to the effect that NATO sort of would retaliate against at least Russian forces in Ukraine, in and around Ukraine. And of course, severe sanctions would be imposed. And then apparently that would be the first exchange, and much would depend on whether Russia escalates. And there are, those who are calling for immediate escalation against NATO and so forth. So what comes then is difficult to predict. But I think that the initial response, I sort of side with those who think that the initial response is going to be massive but conventional. And then maybe some round of negotiation may ensue, but God forbid, and I hope, and I am even confident we are not going to see that.
Great. Well, we are well past the top of the hour now. I want to respect your time, but I thank you all for really, really thoughtful and insightful remarks spanning the whole waterfront of this situation. I'm now used to that. You guys have done a great job on this program, so thank you very much for joining us tonight.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for having us on the show.
Great. Well, we will be back on August 8th, and tentatively we plan to take up the topic of the declining public opinion about American higher education. And got a few guests lined up, and we'll see where we go with that topic. But thank you all for joining us this evening, and on Wisconsin.
Welcome to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, purveyor of Midwestern values. Values like a hard day's work, lending a helping hand, being a friendly neighbor, spending time with family, staying close to home, enjoying the simpler things in life, and living with integrity. It's these values that make a Badger unstoppable.